Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming today. Help yourself to food and drinks throughout. My name is Jamie Babsacklin. I'm here from Melbourne Capital Group. For those that don't know us, we are a international wealth management financial planning business. We help clients fundamentally structure, protect, and grow their assets. That's everything from sort of medical and life insurances through to pensions, savings, investments. We can help with international property purchases. We make sure people get wills together. We're not tax advisors, but we work with tax consultants to make sure that future tax planning is there. And we also, through Matthew, have a citizenship and residency by investment team. Tonight is really talking about people, we call them, let's say, global citizens. So people maybe in mixed nationality marriages. They might be living in one country but from another country. They might want to live in a third country in the future. They might have assets in 4 or 5 different countries. But do they have an overall plan? What's the strategy? What's the focus and plan with that? And that's where we can come in. I guess just on that note, who in this room is married to someone from a different nationality to themselves? Okay, good. Who is planning on retiring in a different country to where they're from? Okay, good. And who's got assets in more than 2 different jurisdictions? There we go. Okay, so hopefully most of today is going to be relevant for everyone. I will let the rest of these guys do introductions themselves. First off, we have Anthony Rogers, who is a British tax advisor who's recently moved to Johor. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, as I say, I'm Anthony Rogers. I am a chartered tax advisor. I'm a trust and estate practitioner. I'm a licensed probate practitioner. So my job is basically talking about really boring and depressing stuff, including tax and death. But we try and look up. Make it as helpful as possible. We guide families through the situation. Most of my advice is from a UK perspective, but I have a lot of international clients who either have assets in the UK or are from the UK originally, or might be kind of thinking going to the UK at some point in the future. But I'm now settled in Malaysia, family are over here, and we love it. And it's a really nice place to spend our time.
Thanks, Anthony. And over to Dan.
I am Dan. I'm Managing Director of Asia Pacific for API Global. API are essentially the global leader in investment grade products from a real estate perspective. So we really see ourselves as essentially wealth management using real estate as the asset class. So we're not people suite who are going and buying homes or anything like that. We're the best in the world in terms of what they have for the real estate portfolios, whether that's wealth preservation, retirement planning, yeah, and obviously we're the only global signed-off party to Melbourne Capital in terms of when people look at this asset class. I'd sit in as part of sort of Jamie's team or one of your wealth advisors for that part as the specialist there.
Thank you. I'm Matthew Green. I head up our residency and citizenship by investment division. I've lived here in KL now for 22 years. The first 15 years I was in the financial planning side of business. For the last 6 years I've purely done investment-based migration, be that golden visas in Europe, moving to the USA on the EB5 program, or obtaining a second passport from countries that offer them. With a wide variety of nationalities and background people, and then we integrate that with the financial planning side of things to make sure that there are any tax hurdles we need to overcome, any investment goals we need to make. So yeah, that's me.
Cheers, Matt. So as I say, we're going to run through sort of a few, I guess, scenarios, but also looking at the different specialities of people, potential future residency places. Most people in this room probably have some kind of questions about tax at some point. Most people don't like tax, right? Potentially rightly so. So a lot of what we're talking about is maybe how to optimize assets, portfolios, residency from a tax perspective, and then kind of link it all back together. If I start off with Anthony, you said you've obviously recently moved to Malaysia from the UK. When you kind of sit down and look at that as a move, what's, I guess, surprises you, or what are things that you need to think about from a estate planning point of view, from tax, and yeah, income tax, estate planning, capital gains tax, for example?
I might have to move this speaker because I think it's going to feed back on myself. Right. I think a lot of the time it depends on where you're coming from, where you're going to, and everywhere has a slightly different viewpoint on it. Everywhere has different taxes, and it always sort of surprises me. When I first came to Malaysia, I went along to a STEP conference. So STEP is the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, and it's a global organisation that deals with people who are looking to plan for estates, for trusts, for setting up for succession. And one of the things that really surprised me there was that coming from the UK, estate planning has really got two very different and distinct wings, in the sense that in the UK we have inheritance tax, and it's 40% on everything you've worked so hard to build up. The other side of it is estate planning, and it's really, estate planning is making sure your assets go to the people you want in the way that you want it to. And in the UK, the main focus has always been almost entirely on inheritance tax planning. And I think coming to different parts of the world, so the conference I was at was a Malaysia and Singapore conference, neither of which have inheritance tax. But it still was a very, very popular conference. There was lots and lots of providers there, because actually it's more than just tax. It's about setting up your legacy. It's about making sure that your assets go to the right people in the right way at the right time. And a big part of that is not just about what happens when you die, it's about what happens during your lifetime. And a big part of what I do for my clients is help them plan during their lifetime, as well as making sure when they eventually leave us, they don't end up with an enormous tax bill.
And I guess just expanding that, so if someone does pass away today and they've got assets in 3, 4, 5 different jurisdictions, what actually happens, and how does it work?
It's a mess. So I have a client I'm dealing with at the moment, and is a lovely chap from the UK originally, married a Malaysian lady, moved to Malaysia, lived in Malaysia for 20 years, had a lovely time, and he had assets in the UK, he had assets in Malaysia, he had assets in the Isle of Man, and he was sensible enough to have a Malaysian will and a non-Malaysian will. And really what tends to happen is, ideally, you would have a will which covers every jurisdiction which you have assets in. And the reason for that is that there's often conflicts between the different types of law. So when somebody dies and they have significant assets around the world, each one of those countries will want a slightly different process to go through. And particularly in countries where there are things like Sharia law, for argument's sake, where there are forced succession rights. So a lot of European countries and a lot of South American countries have forced succession rights that say, unless you have a particular overriding provision, your assets have to be split to certain people in certain proportions. And I think for a lot of people who don't come from a regime where that's a thing, where you can leave your stuff wherever you want to in the UK generally, it's really important to understand how the country that you've got assets in will treat those assets when you die. And if you don't want to go down that route, make sure you've got wills in place which deal with it. Coming back to the client, his Malaysian probate was relatively straightforward. He had a Malaysian will drafted up by a Malaysian lawyer, and that went through probate in Malaysia. At the same time, they applied for probate in the Isle of Man with his other will. So it was kind of Malaysian and Singaporean assets and other assets. And it was perfectly fine, apart from the fact that the lawyers dated the two wills on the same day, and it caused a bit of a complex issue. But that's gone off to the Isle of Man court, but that will also covered his UK assets. So the wills had to go over to the Isle of Man. It's been kept by the Isle of Man courts, and we now have to get kind of a legally certified copy from the Isle of Man courts before we can then go and start the process in the UK. And the UK now asks lots and lots of additional questions because they haven't seen the original will. And if he had a UK will, as well as an Isle of Man will and a UK will, we could have done all three probates at the same time, and it probably would have taken 6 months less. But in this particular situation, because he only had a Malaysian and Singaporean will and a non-Malaysian and Singaporean will, he had to go through a process where he's had to get Isle of Man probate. That Isle of Man probate has then got to be court certified before it can go back to the UK, and the UK then dig into it quite deeply. So, very long story, but the bottom line is make sure that if you've got assets in multiple countries, either the wills are going to be accepted and acknowledged, or you have a separate will for each one of those countries. Without going into too much detail, if you're in Europe, it's a bit more straightforward because there are conventions that allow them to apply wills, which, if you have a Spanish property and a French property and you have one will covering those two countries, generally you're okay. But it's a lot easier if you have a specific will covering your specific assets in that specific country. Don't know whether I've waffled on too much there.
No,
Can
Can I just clarify that? So what you're suggesting is just to have a separate will for each jurisdiction, but one will does not have to refer to another. So my Malaysian will does not have to specify what I have in the UK, for example, because I have a UK will.
Correct. So what you would generally have is your will would do one of two things. So you can have a will which says my worldwide assets, and if it doesn't refer to the country, it's deemed to be your worldwide assets. What you can then have is a will which covers a specific country. So in this particular case, the guy had a will which covered Malaysia and Singapore, and he had then a third will, or a second will, which covered assets outside of Malaysia and Singapore. So ideally, he would have a Malaysian will, a Singaporean will, an English will, and an Isle of Man will. And that would have been the easiest way to deal with everything. But Malaysia and Singapore are not too challenging. Usually the Isle of Man and the UK are not usually too challenging, but it would have been a lot easier if he had a couple of extra wills.
So there's no master will, what you're saying, you basically take individual assets within that country, put a header on it,
Yeah.
and call it will or whatever.
Yeah. You say this is my last will and testament in respect of my assets in the UK or wherever it may be.
So that would also mean that the current rules that, as long as even if you're domiciled in the UK, that would be outside of the inheritance tax, the current rules. You've been out of the country 10 years, for example.
No, because if they're UK assets, even if sorry.
Singapore, Malaysia,
Yep.
wherever, they would be outside of the inheritance tax, as long as you do that specific will.
Your will doesn't affect the IHT position. So you can have a UK will which covers Malaysian assets. I wouldn't recommend it. That doesn't make them UK assets from a UK tax perspective. So the inheritance tax and the will, while they kind of come together as a single thing, they are dealt with separately. So the fact that you've got assets in a UK will doesn't make them UK assets from an inheritance tax point of view. Does that answer your question?
I think what he's saying is, if he's got a will in Malaysia, as an example, those assets aren't touched by inheritance tax in the UK. Is that right?
As long as you've been out of the country within 10 years,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the fact that you've got a Malaysian will doesn't change the inheritance tax position. So you could have a UK will which said, I leave my Malaysian property to my kids, and as long as you're not long-term resident, that's still protected by those rules. So it's not the fact you've got a will. All the will does...
So what do you mean by not long-term?
Oh,
That's going to be a can of worms.
how long have we got? 2 or 3 hours?
Yeah, we can cover it off pretty quickly.
Do you want me to cover that just briefly? So it's...
Sitting around this room, I mean, I've seen the same faces for the last 3-4 years, and I assume there's a lot of us here who are like long-term or permanent.
So this is a UK term, and we're looking at the UK specifically here. Up until last year, the UK had a concept of domicile for inheritance tax purposes, and if you are UK domiciled, you're subject to inheritance tax on your worldwide assets. If you're not UK domiciled, you're only subject to inheritance tax on your UK-based assets. They changed the rules. They tore up domicile and they replaced it with a concept of long-term residence. And somebody who's long-term resident is someone who has been UK resident for 10 of the last 20 years. And it actually makes it a lot easier for UK people to escape the net because you don't have to worry about...
Just UK issue.
This is just a UK issue. This is UK inheritance tax. Yeah. Yeah. So that part of the discussion, the inheritance tax, is really just from my perspective about UK. But obviously you have to be conscious of the fact that if you've got assets in other countries that do charge inheritance tax, that they may well want to charge you inheritance tax on your French property or whatever it may be. But I'm coming at it from a UK perspective.
Yeah, different countries will have different rules in terms of inheritance taxes. Some, as Andrew was saying, like forced heirship. So I think that actually might be the case in France, unless you change it,
Yeah.
it automatically split a certain way. One of the points Anthony was making on having a will for every jurisdiction have assets is very relevant, but at the same time, certain assets, investment portfolios, for example, may offer sort of beneficiary trust solutions. If an asset automatically falls into a trust upon death, then there isn't necessarily a will required. So some of the investment platforms we use, some of the insurance structures, automatically you can have free trust structures which come into effect upon death, which negates the need for probate, negates the need for a will. The companies already do that, and then you already have your beneficiaries. So, yes, you need a will for every jurisdiction you have assets, unless that jurisdiction or the assets in that jurisdiction automatically fall into some kind of trust structure.
And would be, I don't know how familiar are you with Malcolm's stuff, the Paradigm platform,
Yeah.
which is Isle of Man, but the assets within the platform are
Global
all
investments.
around the place.
Yeah.
Where we come from?
So
Is that held in...
yes. So that
Actual asset.
okay. So in this instance, we've got a platform which is based on domicile in the Isle of Man, which simply holds or is the custodian of assets. That it could be, you might have Apple shares, you might have some shares wherever they are, but the assets are actually held on the platform in the Isle of Man. So in theory, you would need a will for the Isle of Man for that platform. However, Arden International offer a pre-beneficiary trust.
Or we could just shout. Yeah.
Basically, that platform offers a beneficiary trust. So upon death of the policyholder, the assets automatically can fall into a beneficiary trust, assuming you've written the trust, completed it, signed it. Therefore, you don't need a will for that. It goes straight into a trust solution, and that trust is then available immediately for beneficiaries wherever they are in the world. Now, depending on where they are, may depend on their tax position of receiving assets, but that's, I guess, the next phase, which is where having different residency programs comes in, because certain countries have taxed them differently. Malaysia is very favourable, they don't tax you on foreign source income, there's no capital gains tax. So a lot of people want to come here and get MM2H here, or live here on different visas. But maybe I'll briefly just bring Matthew in at this point on the tax specific side of things, because he's heading up citizenship and residency programs. So yeah.
And just to add on to that, as well as platforms like that, quite often things like pensions are held in trust. So quite often if you have a pension, be it a UK pension or an international pension, those pensions are usually held in trust. So actually they are outside of the probate process. So if you've got a pension in Luxembourg, for argument's sake, you probably don't need a will in Luxembourg because you will have specified to your trustees who should be the beneficiaries of your pension. You don't need probate for that to pay out.
And to add on to that, from April 2027, so UK pensions have historically always been exempt from inheritance tax. As of April next year, your pension is going to be included in your estate UK inheritance tax. So if you've been saving up and you've got a pension in excess of, as an individual, £325,000, potentially now that's going to be subject to inheritance tax at 40% in the UK. One another very good reason for being in Malaysia is there's a double tax agreement between the UK and Malaysia, which says that your pension can be paid out as long as you're 55 years old or above and you're of pension age, and you can withdraw your pension. You can actually go through the double tax agreement and have your pension income taxed in Malaysia. Now in Malaysia, they're not going to tax you on foreign source income. So in theory, and actually with a lot of my clients at the moment with UK pensions, if they're over the age of 55, we're going through that process, going through the double tax agreement, and looking to draw those pension assets entirely out of the UK. Gross of tax in the UK, and then non-taxable here in Malaysia. Now we just take those pension assets and reinvest them in the Isle of Man. We can invest them in the same things they're invested in, but there's no income tax, no capital gains tax, and more importantly, if you've been outside of the UK in the British for at least 10 years, no inheritance tax. So, yeah, lots of things, lots of opportunities, which is also why people these days are a lot more focused on where do I want to live in the future from a tax residency standpoint, and what can I do with that. So I guess, yeah, I'll bring Matthew in. What sort of...
One last thing.
Yeah.
Really, as well, we've been mitigating inheritance tax from an asset perspective in things like real estate by setting up an FIC, so a fund investment company. And you hold A shares, your kids have B shares, so that gifting structure is in there. So that's another way of sort of moving outside of it, basically. So you structure it in that way. One of my clients did it in a really nice way. They're in the tree reviewing the apples.
Yeah, we can explain a bit of that in a bit more detail later. Now, Matthew.
I'll shout. I'm good at shouting. But historically, my role, I always dealt with people that have weak passports that were looking for other benefits. So people who were active everywhere. Sorry. Okay. I'm here again. So historically, I would always work with people with weak passports who were looking for mobility options. So people that had to get visas for everywhere they want to go. So they go and get residency in a country that gives them a permanent Shenzhen visa, or they get a passport that has visa-free access to more countries than they currently have. Now, in the last few years, this has changed dramatically. I'm now working a lot with American clients who are driven by the political situation in their home country. Politics getting polarized, where most people are actually very happy-centric, so they don't like how far left and far right politics is going, so they've got no intention of moving home. And they want to talk about where's a tax-efficient place to live that's got a more moderate political situation. And then more and more, the conversation I'm starting to talk with British people who followed on from the IHT situation, and they're now looking, if I move back to the UK, I suddenly pull all those assets into a taxable scenario, where can I retire that's much more tax friendly? So we start looking at the places like Portugal, who have a golden visa, where their income tax regime is not so friendly. It's very similar to the UK, but their inheritance tax is only, well, they don't call it inheritance tax, call it stamp duty. It's only 10%. However, if you pass it to either your parents, your spouse, your children, or your grandchildren, it's zero. Or they look to move to Italy. Now, Italy has a lovely tax regime for retirees. If you move to southern Italy, to a town that has less than 30,000 residents, of which there are thousands of them, you can enjoy a 7% flat tax on all your worldwide income that you bring into Italy. And their inheritance tax is tax exempt for 1 million euros per descendant, and then only 4% above that. So you can pass literally millions of euros to your children, your spouse, your grandchildren, and pay no tax. And of course, Italy is a particularly nice place to live. And then Turkey has recently entered the fray. They have a citizenship by investment program. You buy property for $400,000, you get a Turkish passport in under a year. It wasn't such a popular program, so it's not the strongest passport in the world, but they've just announced they're starting a new tax regime where you'll be fully exempt for 20 years on all your worldwide income, all your capital gains, and all inheritance tax. So Turkey's suddenly becoming part of the conversation. We're also talking to people that are sat on considerable gains in cryptocurrency and want to know which countries actually recognise that and don't tax them on it. So again, we're going back to Portugal. Portugal actually have it written in their tax code that if you've held cryptocurrency for more than 1 year and you dispose of it, there's zero capital gains tax. And Cyprus is similar. If you're a Cyprus resident, then there's zero capital gains tax on any assets outside the country. And uniquely, at Cyprus, you can become a tax resident in only 60 days. Most countries require you to be in country for 183 days before you're a tax resident. In Cyprus, as long as you don't spend 183 days in any other country, you're a tax resident after only 60 days. So people that are sat on considerable crypto gains are looking very much to go there. So the demographic has changed dramatically in just 2 or 3 years from mobility to tax planning.
So obviously talking about a lot of different people looking at having, let's say, a plan B, is it something which you think most people should consider now? And if they are considering it, you've mentioned a few programs there's obviously quite a lot of programs out there. Which ones are people actually using and which ones maybe sound great on paper, but the reality is not quite so good?
It's certainly not for everybody, because a lot of people are very happy where they are right now, here in Malaysia, or will happily return to their home country. They've got no need for what I do. An increasing amount of people, as I mentioned before, are looking at options. So what still works? The European Golden Visas still work. Although they're closing down at a scary rate, Portugal is still open, Greece is still open, Italy is still open, Cyprus is still open. They are all getting used. The USA, EB5, still really works for people that want to go to the US, particularly that's used by people who want to send their children to study in the US and then for them to remain there. The USA just made it incredibly difficult to get a visa after studying, and now to get an F1B, it's going to cost you $100,000 that your employer must pay, and you go into a lottery. There are some in Asia, none that we deal with. So we've got Malaysia, my second home. You have to be a Malaysian company to deal with that. The Philippines have a program. It's really not very popular.
The Thailand one, which is your wealthy global citizen.
Thailand have wealthy global citizen, but it's not by investment. You just need to be wealthy. I only deal with the programs that require you to invest money to go there. But yeah, Thailand have a program. If you have more than $1 million US in total, $500,000 US in Thailand, you can go live there.
They're residency programs rather than citizenship, aren't they, as well?
They are, yes, they are, yeah.
And you don't get taxed on your worldwide income.
You don't get taxed on your income. No, you deal direct with the government for that. It's just on your net worth. You need to invest $500,000 into property or government bonds or bank accounts in Thailand, have another $500,000 US somewhere else, and you can go live in Thailand.
That's probably just quite a good segue to bring Dan in, because I know in terms of property investments, to talk about Thailand specifically, do you want to talk us through, I guess, generally how you would recommend building out a retirement income strategy, but also maybe Thailand specifically, some options that you might have in terms of investing in property there so that you can also then be a part of some of these Thai residences?
Yeah, so look, there's a couple it all depends on what you're trying to do here, first of all. So every single individual will have a different destination that they're trying to get to, and also a trajectory to retirement, right? And usually what we're doing is working very closely with guys like Matt, where we're looking at, okay, we want to live here, we need to get a visa, but we're looking at all the tax mitigation, and usually it's with being able to take offshore funds in there as tax efficient as possible. So I'll show an example in the UK and how we would structure that, because you can do things like tax-free dividends if you're in a good tax environment, owner loan repayment if it's a bad tax environment, even in the UK. But specifically in Thailand, we're working with a lot of guys lots of people want to go and live there. Phuket is the only investment grade area in Thailand, and everything in real estate is about supply and demand, right? So from a Thailand perspective, there's only Phuket, and that's because you've got about 4 million people who live there and nearly 20 who go there each year. So if you're renting your place out on a day rate, like a hotel, it's one of the best yield markets in the world because of that. But there are inherent risks of how you structure ownership and so on and so forth. So I would always strongly advise looking at, I mean, we looked over 100 developments in Thailand. We've signed off on 2. The Marriott branded residence is there, and one called Sudara, which is the guys who built Lan Kwai Fong and Alan Zerman, which gives you freehold ownership, or rolling leaseholds where you can just send an email to them and say, I want to renew it. So you actually have consistent growth across there. And what's happened is, with particularly the wars that have gone on, so in the Middle East and the Russian war, it's now seen as sort of a global safe haven. But even before that, you've had consistently, I think, average of 6.4% growth from a capital appreciation standpoint over the last 10 years, and you've gone through things like COVID and so on and so forth. And so we're seeing a lot of migration in the region in particular to go and live there, even places like from Singapore, from Malaysia, so on and so forth, because people have got regional roles, and they've got now British international schools, they've got world-class healthcare, digital nomad visas. So very interesting environment, which people are interested in. A very good yield environment. If we were going back to the scenario of what I would do in a good retirement structure, if we've got sort of 10 years out from retirement, let me show you an example. So this is the type of structure that I'd usually be looking at for clients if we're trying to maximize your return on capital during that time, and then create large passive income in retirement. And so in this, let's use an example. We've got £750,000 invested. We buy, 10 properties with about 3 million valuation, and each property has got, say, 2k a month coming in. So we'll have 240,000. Apologies about my little girl's writing, it's terrible. But remember here, we've got 750,000 invested. We buy 10 properties at a valuation of 3 million. And we've got about 240,000 coming in from a rental perspective. Right, so really what we'd be, and in the structure, I'll talk to you about the structure that we'd go into, but let's just use this as an example here. So, right, we invested 750k, 750,000, bought £3 million worth of property, right? Now, on an average, sorry. Oh yeah, sorry, so you'd use leverage in here. So we'd use a mortgage in here to get us from A to B. And the reason why we want to use leverage in these environments is, while staying cash flow positive, if we're only investing 25% into a property, every 1% that grows is 4% return on capital invested. So we compound. And that's how you really make your money work as hard as possible in real estate. Yeah, we can help end to end. So yeah, we'll help end to end with that. We'll even rent them all out. And I've got 15 properties live with API. Don't know the name of any of my tenants. Never spoken to anyone about a boiler breaking, so it's fully managed. But the key thing here is you'll have made, on an average of UK growth, and the reason why UK makes sense for investors is macro and micro fundamentals, right? So there's a reason why it's the second most traded market in the world. And that's because you've got nearly 80 million people living in a tiny island with only a certain amount of land, and a 4.2 million gap in supply and demand of units. So there's a 50-year gap, right, where we're not going to catch up with the supply and demand. You know, places like KL, you've got an oversupply. That's why the yields are terrible. Anything that we put you into, you're going to be working at around a 6% yield, which will cover the what we call washing its own face in terms of the debt. I would advise not paying off any debt at the moment because inflation's at 3.8%, so let's let the debt crush itself. And it's all about time in the market. So on an average in the UK, over 7 years, you'll have made £1 million on 3 million. I'll do that a lot faster because ours is the best investment grade product. To give you an idea, we looked at over 1,000 developments last year in the UK and we signed off on 12. So it's all about finding the very best investment grade product. But for easy maths, let's say for the first 5 years, what we're trying to do is create this 1 million here. Then what we're doing is, for the next 5, because we're 5 years out from retirement, we're using this to drive down the debt in here, right? So really what we'd be doing, we'd probably have a whole co and we'd have different subsidiary companies. And if we had company A here that has higher yield, maybe we've got a 10% yield in that, we'd pay that one off faster because that gives us cash flow in our business. But say we've got company C here, which say the capital appreciation is good, but the yield isn't great, we might release equity out of here. Because if we've only got 20% in here, every 1% that grows is 5% return on capital invested. So, and anything I would put any client into would be moving at that level. So if we moved at just 5% for 2 years, that's 50% return on capital invested. So our money's sweating really hard here while kicking out cash flow here. But if we're just trying to pay out the debt of this as quickly as possible, we put this 1 million in here, so we paid off 1.75 and we owe 1.25. Now remember, day one, we had 240,000 coming in. So let's say for easy maths, after the 5 years, that's 300,000, right? So then we owe 1.25 million and we've got 300,000 coming in. So for the next, if we wanted to take 100,000 out a year, we can do that and then pay it off slower. If we just wanted to pay that off as quickly as possible, we would use this to pay this off for the next 5 years. Then by that stage, we probably got a £5 million asset when we're ready to retire, with probably 350k coming in, of which you're paying between 19 and 24% tax. So net, if you were in somewhere like Matt would teach you to be in, where you don't pay tax on your worldwide income, you could be taking tax-free dividends of around £270,000 to £290,000. And that's how I would scale a portfolio if you were looking to retire, make your money work as hard as possible over a 10-year period. And all this is structure, mapping, where you buy, and obviously, you know, the tax mapping strategy is key. Well, you've got 300 years worth of that. You know, if you talk about macro, yeah, I mean, it's where you buy. So, for instance, we haven't been talking about buying central London for 10 years as a business. That's still grown, but you know, you don't buy that because the price is too high and the yield isn't good enough. Places like Manchester, as an example, we had 45.7% growth over the last 5 years. If you invest 25%, that's 200% return on capital invested. The macro growth of that region alone at the moment is growing at around 5 to 7% a year annually. And then we've got areas like Birmingham, Gava, where, you know, if you buy in there at the moment, where you've got this the HS2 line, which is coming in there, well, you've already had billions spent. It's already been the most expensive train line. That's happening. That's a 10 billion economic boost to the city, where, you know, Canary Wharf, if you look at half of retail banking now, is already in Birmingham. So if you look at actually the macro growth of Manchester and Birmingham in comparison to a London, they're the winners. So this, excuse my French about the government, this silly government, I'll put it that way, they're actually the winners of that are Birmingham and Manchester, because of the macro shifts that are moving people there and companies. So actually, you've even got in Manchester, you've got 120,000 students, one of the largest student education figures in the whole of the Europe, with a 51.5% stay rate. So you've got, what's happening is as well now, you've got people like Bank of New York Mellon, Amazon, Google, BBC, all sticking headquarters in there, which is sucking up young talent. So all that means is the growth of the city grows, and if you're only investing 25% and it's moving at 5% a year, you're doing 100% return on capital every 4 or 5 years, which creates this, drives down this, and then gives you the passive income here. Promise I can do it for you guys. Oh, sorry.
Property as a potential asset class as part of a wider portfolio. We obviously do a lot of other stuff as well. There's a lot of positive you spoke about there. What's an actual risk with property? Give us a negative about property so that...
Okay. No, look, there's two. Yeah. Yeah. I would say it's a liquid by nature, right? So the illiquidity of it, outside of being able to release equity, it's about time in the market. It's not about day trading, so it has to be that. And you know, really it's about structure, right? If you're not getting the right advice and you're talking to your granddad's sister's brother and we buy down the road because that looks like a nice house, you'll still make money, but you're not going to do anything like this. And the biggest thing actually when we talk about retirement planning, and this is why fundamentally it should be part of anyone's retirement, is it has two revenue streams: capital appreciation and yield. So you're not drawing down from a fund, right? It's an inflation-proof business that just kicks out money for you. So once you structure that correctly, it's a business for the family. And when you put it in these FIC structures, it's retirement planning, succession planning, wealth preservation. You can pay for your grandkids. Yeah. Thanks.
So I guess go back to you, Anthony, to we've got a bit of time left, and welcome any questions coming along as well. If a family kind of came to you now, internationally mobile, assets in multiple places, let's say they're worth between $3 and $5 million, what is the first thing that you would tell them to do? And if they didn't do anything, what are the potential consequences of just leaving things as they are?
So I think the key thing to understand with a family like that is, what have you got? Where are you now? Where are you going to? What have you put in place to date to resolve that? Because you would be amazed the number of wealthy clients that I speak to who haven't got a will at all, and don't actually appreciate what happens if you don't have a will. And again, UK perspective here, but I had a group of 3 brothers who had a £300 million property portfolio, and they didn't have a will between them. And I said, you guys know what happens if you die here? And they were like, well, it all just goes to my wife. We don't have to worry about it till second death. I'm like, no. UK intestacy rules say that half of your assets are going to your children. And your children are under 18. If they're over 18, we can do a deed of variation, we can play with things. But these guys individually had £100 million worth of property each. And if one of them dies, £50 million of that goes to their children directly. And they're going to pay inheritance tax on that. And they'd have a £20 million tax bill, which means they've got to sell a lot of properties to pay the tax bill. Which you can't do till you've got probate, and there are mechanisms to get around that. But it is, it's making sure they've got the fundamentals in place. Now, if that family lived in Malaysia, we're going to be less concerned about inheritance tax, but we are then going to be concerned about their religion. We're going to be concerned about what they're going to do longer term. And it's all then about kind of building a longer term plan for them. It's about understanding what happens if you do die. Where do your assets go to? Now, if you've got a couple of kids and you want your stuff to go to your kids, simple, goes to the kids. But what if one of those kids has learning difficulties? What if the kids are in a sort of slightly rocky marriage? How do you protect against that? How do you ensure that the assets that you've got don't end up with the ex-wife? And I have a friend of the family where he had built up a business. He sold his business, and the day after he sold his business, the wife handed him the divorce papers. And it's just about making sure that if you're in a situation where there is significant assets, that those assets are protected, that they're wrapped up in trusts, they're wrapped up in family investment companies, they're wrapped up in vehicles that provide you with a bit of control. And with a lot of my clients, the primary thought is tax. And that might be in early stages, it might be about income tax, it might be about inheritance tax, it might be about how what they're going to do if they do move to another country. But it's kind of understanding where they've come from, what they're doing now, where they're going to, and what happens when they die. And it's a big picture thing, and it really is important to kind of understand everything about what that client is doing, because everybody's circumstances are different.
Yeah, it's good. And it's also interesting I actually had a conversation earlier today with an American guy based in Thailand, and he has a pretty successful company based out of the US. He's generating sort of probably $30,000 a month excess to him. His fiance is Cambodian. He has a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old, and he's like, my total net worth, he's got a property in Vegas, and he's like, we went through it, and he's like, I was like, he's thinking about setting up actually a trust at the moment, US trust, living trust, wills, everything else. I was like, great, fantastic. His soon-to-be wife has already been scammed out of $30,000 before. She's also agreed they don't want any money to be in her name when she receives it at all, because she, in his words, literally grew up in a village in the middle of nowhere in Cambodia. She doesn't know whether it's $100, $1,000, $100,000. It doesn't mean anything. So in his case, I was like, okay, well, go back to the start. You've got 2 young kids. You've got $1 million on paper apparently, but actually 3/4 of that's in property in the US. He had about 250 liquid. And then I was like, so are your family actually going to be okay if something happens to you? Have you even considered life insurance in this instance? And he was like, I don't need to, I'm worth $1 million. They're going to go back to Cambodia. I was like, but they've actually, okay, let's say maybe right now you're worth $1 million, of which 3/4 is in a property which they're not going to have access to. You've got no wills in place. Let's fast forward 5 years, and your 5-year-old has been at international school for 5 years in Thailand. Are the children then going to be happy just going back to Cambodia and living in a shack? Probably not. So if a lot of what we do, what I do as a financial planner, is actually look into the future for people and try and help them with that long-term thinking rather than just, what are you doing right now? Which I guess is kind of part of all this. I could ask each of you this, I could ask Dan and Matt the same kind of things. Dan's going to tell you to do that, I would imagine. And again,
That's what I do with my money, by the way.
it's, yeah, and
This is what I do.
And actually, it goes back to having a fully diversified and long-term plan. Even as Dan's saying, in terms of the properties, if you're building out a property portfolio and the plan is one of them's capital growth, one of them's income, as long as you've got structures in place and you know that how you're going to work it, the same goes for kind of financial planning. If you're out of work for a while, or you want to retire but your pensions don't kick in for another 4 or 5 years, so you're going to actually draw down on some of your capital for a period of time, as long as that's part of the plan, that's fine. It doesn't matter. But you need a plan is the key. You need to know what's the tax position going to be, where are you going to live, what happens if you do pass away, any sort of structuring and everything else in place, and kind of fitting all that together, and using, whether it be Melbourne Capital Group as your overarching advisor, and then we work with tax advisors and residency and property. It's kind of just making sure that longer term plan is there. Does anybody have any questions specific?
And what you want to do and how well you want to live.
Correct. And what lifestyle do you want? Yeah. What lifestyle do you actually want? Having conversation with Scott earlier, he's just headed off. His youngest child is about to go to university in the UK, and he said he was speaking to one of his former colleagues who's retired now, and the guys, the children are older. The guys just decided that they're going to go and spend a year in Bali. He's rented a villa for like $8,000 for a year, and then Scott's like, yeah, actually, I could do that. And sometimes you don't need as much as maybe you think you do, depending on where you live, depending on the tax position, of course. Yeah. Any final points from anyone else here? Any questions from anyone at all regarding programs or tax or property or otherwise? Otherwise,
Last thing I was going to say, actually, FX, right? Because if you are thinking about different jurisdictions and things like that, hedge FX, right? If you're living in Malaysia and you're living in ringgit and you're earning pounds or dollars or USD, things like that, there's a big compounding nature of that as well. Diversification around your assets on that, I would suggest as well.
actually, yeah, I'll just add in one other point, which was Matthew was talking about countries that don't necessarily tax you on crypto gains. Okay, maybe we don't have many people in the room that have got significant crypto assets, Bitcoin or otherwise, but there are now countries that will accept cryptocurrencies in payment for assets, be that property or otherwise. I believe Bali, Thailand and Bali will, UAE, all of these places will now accept crypto as payment for property. And also worth adding that Anthony can also help in terms of structuring for crypto-based assets at the same time. We'll still be around. Feel free to have more food, drinks. If anyone's got any questions, come and grab us. Otherwise, Anthony's also got some cards here, but you've all got our details. But yeah, come and grab us for any questions. Enjoy the drinks, and see you guys another time. Thanks to everyone for coming.